Um, if you can tag Miko Peled official on Facebook, that'll be great.
Right. I think we are fine now. Moment.
Is it possible? Is that possible for you to do?
Of course, of course, of course. I think we are live now. Yes. Um, yes, we are. Good. Is it good morning to you?
Good morning. Yes, it is morning.
It is. It's the evening here in South Africa. I'm not sure if my visual is bad. Can you see me?
I can see you. It's a little bit dark, but I can see you.
How is the
Not
lighting?
great. The light.
So good morning, Comrade Miko. Welcome to the Africa for Palestine webinar series. We are very grateful to have you with us today.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Those who are not familiar with our work in the audience, we are Africa for Palestine, a Palestine human rights solidarity movement based in South Africa and doing work in the African continent. Our work is primarily to raise awareness on the Palestinian question in the African continent and to push back Israeli influence into the continent. We work with several organizations and movements in the South African continent, in the African continent, excuse me, from religious formations to civil society movements, different political parties, and the broader scope of civil society movement as well. So we have started a webinar series from last month. I think if it's not July, we have had different guests from different walks of life on this webinar series to speak about the Palestinian question, to share ideas, and to build from what we've done in the solidarity movement. Today we're joined by Miko Peled, who is not a stranger to South Africa. He was here with us, I think, 4 years back. How are you doing, Miko?
I'm doing very well. I'm really happy that you've invited me to participate in this.
Oh, wonderful. So let's get into it. Who is Miko Peled? Tell us briefly about yourself and the audience.
So let me start by saying thank you again, and just saying that I think that Africa for Palestine is an incredibly important initiative. As you mentioned, Israel is trying to get more and more support among the African countries. Especially lately, we know that Sudan is about to start diplomatic relations. Officials from Chad have had meetings with the Israeli Prime Minister just recently in occupied Jerusalem, and it's important to emphasize just how important it is that there is a strong Palestinian solidarity organization and movement in Africa. And that Israel does not succeed in getting its claws into the African nations. So I thank you for the initiative. And again, thank you for allowing me to participate. My own story, and by the way, it was a pleasure, a wonderful experience to be in South Africa with all of you. And my own story is I was raised as a privileged Zionist Israeli in a very Zionist family. I always say, I did not learn about Zionism in a textbook or in a college course. I learned about Zionism growing up in around the dinner table at home. I had family members who were held important positions within the Zionist movement, within the state of Israel, within the establishment of the state of Israel. I had an uncle who was a president and a grandfather who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence when Israel was established in 1948. And my own father was a general, like, the title of my book, The General's Son. So my father was a general. He was among the Israeli officers who were responsible for the rise and success of Mobutu in the Congo and the crimes that were committed there. And so remembering Patrice Lumumba and what the Congolese people have gone through is I think it's important. And again, to emphasize the role of Israel in those crimes, I think is important for all Africans to remember. and of course Israeli support for the apartheid regime in South Africa and in Rhodesia. And then I took a journey, which is not perhaps a likely journey, from the sphere of this privileged in which Israeli Jews live, Zionists live in occupied Palestine, into the sphere of the other, into the Palestinian sphere. And the subtitle of my book is A Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, which really forces more than anything the conversation or the discussion on what is Israel and what is Palestine, what is an Israeli and where is Palestine. And the journey that I embarked on several decades ago showed me that all of Israel is occupied Palestine, and that we Israelis are settlers, colonizers. We are responsible for a brutal racist regime that has been destroying Palestine and destroying the Palestinian people for close to 100 years now. And I was forced to make a choice whether I continue with my, my life, my loyalty to Zionism, to racism, to the brutality that comes with it, with an apartheid regime, or do I follow my conscience and my beliefs in humanity and human rights, injustice, and so forth? And the choice was very clear. It wasn't easy because it was personal, but it was clear to me that the only way I could move forward is to reject Zionism, reject Israel, and point out precisely why it is important to reject Israel, reject Zionism, and join the Palestinian struggle for freedom and justice. So that is in a nutshell. That is that's the story. That's my story.
One could understand and sympathize with you on that journey where you come from. Unlike many others who across the world give soldier to Palestine, you've experienced their oppression firsthand. You've lived amongst those who oppress them. Are those some of the compelling reasons that got you to be active in the solidarity movement, to see the pain of Palestinians on a daily?
Well, what compelled me, I mean, it's a process. My own personal experience includes a very sad experience, which was the death of my sister's little girl in a suicide attack in Jerusalem, which was executed by Palestinians. And the notion that three young men, healthy, educated, with no reason to do something so horrific, would take their own lives and then bring so much pain and kill other people, innocent people, was not something that I could just let go of. I mean, this is a serious thing. What in the world would bring three young people to take their own lives and to take the lives of others? And that is really what propelled me to this journey, to see to see Palestine, to meet with Palestinians. And then having met Palestinians and having traveled into the sphere in which Palestinians live within occupied Palestine, because Palestine is very segregated, incredibly segregated, even though, it's far smaller than South Africa, for example, much smaller. The segregation is very, very effective. I mean, even though sometimes the communities live across the street from each other, they have no connection to one another. And the segregation is complete. So to take that journey and to see what it's like on the other side, what is the life of Palestinians? And the first things that you see are quite simple. You see lack of access to water, the inability to travel, the lack of access to simple resources, school, education, so forth. The limits that are placed on Palestinians because the narrative is that this is the land of Israel and Jews have a right to live there. And this, of course, comes at the expense of the native people of Palestine. And this is a very difficult thing to see. You look back at your own background, at your family background, and you realize just how severe this is, just the depth of the oppression, the brutality of the oppression, the brutality of the apartheid. And so that's really what propelled me to continue the journey and also to speak out and become active.
And how has this decision affected your relationship with the Israelis and the broader Jewish community?
Well, within Israel, of course, this is very difficult because the narrative is very strong in Israel. The narrative is everything, that we have a right to be there, that we returned after 2,000 years, which of course is part of the mythology that Zionism was founded upon. And when you reject that, you basically reject what it means to be an Israeli. You reject Zionism, and Israel people don't reject that. People see that as treachery, which doesn't really bother me that much. But that's the reality. Among Jewish communities abroad, it's less severe because you have, there's no such thing as a Jewish community. There are many, many communities that are Jewish. Some are very religious and they reject Zionism. They've always rejected Zionism. The ultra-Orthodox Jews have always rejected Zionism. You have more liberal, secular Jews, some of which accept Zionism and some which reject Zionism. And then, of course, you have the very powerful, very loud, very obvious Zionist Jewish communities. So, obviously, my friendship, my work is among the Jewish communities that reject Zionism. But in Israel, it is severe. In Israel, it's seen as people are shocked when they hear this notion that Zionism is to be rejected, that Zionism, there's a clip that they like to show of me, some of the Zionist groups that are active on social media, where I state that Israel does not commit violations of international law. Israel itself is a violation of international law. The very existence of the state of Israel is the violation because it is an apartheid regime, which we know violates international law. Apartheid has been defined as a crime. It is engaged in ethnic cleansing, which again is a very well-defined crime in international law, and it is engaged in genocide. And if we look at the definitions of these three crimes as they are described, as they are defined in international law, and we compare them to what the state of Israel is in its entirety, we see that it fits. Israel is precisely the violation of these three very serious crimes. And Israelis don't like to see that. They don't like to hear that, of course.
We had something similar in South Africa. People like Pius Node, who were Afrikaner, because apartheid was really entrenched in African nationalism, and the idea, similar to Israel, is that we are victim from somewhere, and God promised us this particular land. And many were called self-hating whites. They were equated as an anomaly in society. Do you experience the same from the Zionist section of the Israeli community?
Yes, to be honest, I find it comical when they use these terms like self-hating and so forth. And why do you hate yourself? And I'm thinking, I don't hate myself at all. It has nothing to do with that. What I despise is the racism. What I despise is the system of oppression. What I despise is the fact that so many Israelis are willing to participate and support because Israel is a democracy for Jews. For the Israeli Jews, there are options. Israeli Jews could stand up tomorrow and protest and demand, for example, that the siege on Gaza be lifted, that the 2 million people in Gaza be allowed to have access to water and medicine, the very simple things, electricity that, some of us can take for granted. But they don't. Israelis willingly participate in this regime, even though they do have a choice, because Israeli society, for Jews, the apartheid system is a democracy. But they do not, and so this is a very, very, so the hatred is not a self-hatred. It's not a question of that. It's a question of standing up against a system of injustice and brutality.
And of course, what is widely being used these times for those who are pro-Palestine, that you are anti-Semitic. Have you also had Have you also had encounters with Jewish Israelis, Jewish people who call you anti-Semitic for your activism?
Yes, of course. They've weaponized this notion of anti-Semitism, and they've weaponized it to a degree that is very effective. I have to say. I'm sure you recall in the United Kingdom, Jeremy Corbyn, who was really very close to becoming prime minister, was brought down, and the entire Labour Party was actually brought down as a result of a very effective campaign that described them as anti-Semitic. And really, Jeremy Corbyn was not even remotely anti-Semitic. You know, his fight was against racism, and his fight was against injustice everywhere, but he dared to include Palestine in that, and so he was brought down. In fact, I did a Zoom event with some panelists about that a couple of months ago. So this is a campaign. This weaponizing of anti-Semitism is a campaign which is vicious, which is far-reaching, and needs to be, we need to come to terms with this, because I'm sure people are going to see this in Africa. People have experienced this in Europe all the time, that if you dare to stand against Zionism, then you're somehow anti-Semitic. But I think if we break it down, we realize anti-Semitism is a form of racism. Zionism is racism. So if you oppose Zionism, you are opposing racism. You're opposing a racist ideology. And so it's almost comical to say that anybody who opposes Zionism and rejects the state of Israel is somehow anti-Semitic or racist in any way, because it's precisely the opposite. Standing with Zionism, supporting Zionism and supporting Israel is supporting a racist system, an apartheid system. Whereas standing against it is fighting racism and fighting all forms of racism, really.
And interesting that you mentioned Comrade Jeremy Corbyn. The same instrument is applied in the United States politics. We've seen it with Bernie Sanders to some extent, but to Mark Lamont Hill of the Black Lives Matter movement, those who dare to speak against Israel are labeled as anti-Semitic. They don't touch people. So how can we in the Solidarity movement counter it?
Well, several ways. I think that first of all, it's important to stick to the facts and to stick to the reality and to stick to what we believe in. You know, the struggle, to the solidarity with Palestinians, and the struggle. And I see this more than just solidarity. I see this as participating in the Palestinian struggle. For example, supporting BDS, supporting boycott against Israel is not just solidarity. This is participating in the struggle, as I believe we all should be doing. And we just keep reminding people that the Zionist ideology, which is the ideology upon which the state of Israel was established, is an inherently racist, brutal ideology. And the result of this ideology, in other words, the actual implementation of this ideology, is the state of Israel, which has for close to 100 years, even in other words, even before the state itself was established, has been engaged in ethnic cleansing, in genocide, and in racist policies, clearly. And all you have to do is look at what has happened in Palestine over the last 100 years. So it's actually very easy to show. Now, besides all of that, I mean, there are so many Jewish people who are part of the anti-apartheid movement, in Palestine movement, just like there were in South Africa and in other countries. It's really not about being Jewish or not being Jewish. It's got nothing to do with liking Jews or hating Jews or anybody else. It's about a struggle against apartheid. It's a struggle against racism and violence. And if anybody claims that supporting the Palestinian cause is somehow anti-Semitic, somehow racist. So what is it when you support Zionism? What is it when you support the state of Israel, which we know has been keeping 2 million people in the Gaza Strip in a concentration camp, that bombs them on a regular basis, does not allow them the basic most needs? A child in the Gaza Strip with a curable cancer will die. A child being born a few kilometers away from the Gaza Strip with the same curable cancer will live, because Israel determines who has access to medical care. You know, even we leave out the bombing, we leave out the racist laws, we leave out the oppression, just something that basic, you know. A child with a disease that can be cured will die because they were born on a certain side of a boundary, which is an artificial boundary. The Gaza Strip is an artificial creation. And what do you call that? I mean, isn't that the worst form of racism? So opposing that is somehow anti-Semitic. You know, when you break it down, it just shows how ridiculous and how absurd the claims are that somehow anti-Zionism is racism or anti-Semitism.
Since we met in South Africa, you're very synonymous with the pink badge. It's something that
Yes.
I think I've seen only you very consistent with. So you've been very much actively participating in the BDS movement. Tell us about the participation. Tell us about that movement, and also for our audience who might not be aware.
Well, and inspired by the experience in South Africa, the Palestinians came out with a call to impose boycott, divestment, and sanctions against the state of Israel, which again, by the way, is labeled in America and in Europe and by the Zionists as anti-Semitic. And I always encourage people to look at the specific demands of the BDS call because they are very specific demands. And these demands are demands for equality, so equal rights, ending the military occupation in parts of Palestine where they are governed by the military, and a return of the refugees to their lands and their home. Basically justice, equality, and freedom. How can that be anti-Semitic? I mean, these demands are so reasonable. These demands are so remedial. In other words, they don't talk about destroying anything. There's no demand to kill or to punish. It's a demand to remedy what has been done to the Palestinians. And these are the three aspects. You know, the Palestinians live without freedom. There's no equality in Palestine under the Israeli regime, under the apartheid regime. The demand to end the military occupation, in other words, the parts of Palestine which still exist under military regime and military law, which only applies, by the way, to Palestinians, and to the right of people to return to their homes and their land, people who were viciously exiled at gunpoint, is so basic. So I think it's important to look at the demands and then realize that the call for BDS is reasonable and it is just and it is the right thing to do morally. And really, I believe, and when I was in South Africa, I heard this from so many people that, BDS had a huge hand in bringing down apartheid, the apartheid regime. And I believe that the BDS has the potential to do the same thing in Palestine. It's just a question of people standing behind this banner and participating actively and demanding that their leaders heed the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against the state of Israel. And again, I can't emphasize enough how important it is that this take place and develops in the strongest possible way in Africa, because nobody, so many countries in Africa have suffered as a result of Israeli participation in the colonization and the destruction and the pillage that took place. Congo is one example, of course, South Africa, Rhodesia, but there are other countries that have suffered directly as a result of Israel collaborating with the colonizers and with the stealing of resources and so forth from so many parts of Africa. So this is to me so simple. Supporting BDS, I believe, is such a simple choice. It's such a simple decision. And again, the claims that somehow it's anti-Semitic are ludicrous. How can it be anti-Semitic to oppose racism? How could it be anti-Semitic to demand justice and freedom and equality for people?
Because there's a growing sentiment amongst the Israelis, and most particularly what they call themselves left Zionists, that the dream of a democracy, the dream of a legitimate, if I may put it, state of Israel is slowly withering away with the annexation plans, with the Jewish state laws. These are an escalation of Israel's racist settler colonial policies, and of course the aggression, the continued aggression on Palestinians being shot at, killed, Gaza being bombed, do you think many Israelis will realize that this is a dream that we'll never see? This is a myth. Israel is in fact a settler colonial state. Israel is in fact an apartheid racist state, and therefore join the Palestine solidarity movement.
You know, I think Israelis will realize this the day after it's over. In other words, you know, I meet white South Africans, you know, from time to time. There's a big community in America, and they all forgot. You know, I hear this all the time. Oh, we loved Nelson Mandela. We were all opposed to apartheid. You know, I think the change will come when it's over. Once the state of Israel is forced to transform itself from an apartheid regime to a real inclusive democracy, then Israelis will wake up and realize that this was a myth. They're not going to do that until they're forced to do that. In other words, it's not going to happen until they're forced to do that. I mean, I remember when de Klerk stood up and declared that Nelson Mandela will be freed, the other political prisoners will be freed, they will unban all the political parties, and they called for a one person, one vote election in South Africa. That was officially the end of the apartheid regime. I believe that this is going to happen as well. It might even be this Prime Minister Netanyahu who ends up being the man standing up and saying this. The day after this happens, when, and of course, like I said, Palestine is much smaller than South Africa, and I think the integration is going to be faster because of that. And Israeli children will go to school with Palestinian children, and they will have a prime minister who is a Palestinian and a headmaster in school who is a Palestinian. And they will realize that there's no reason not to live together as equals. And the sky is not going to fall. It's going to be just fine. That is when Israelis wake up and realize that this was a lie and a myth. It's not going to happen until they are forced to do so. And I think that's, again, going back to the importance of the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Only when they are brought to their knees, which again is what happened with South Africa. Apartheid South Africa was on its knees. You know, I mean, it began in Angola and gradually, you know, South Africa, I remind people, South Africa actually controlled all of Southern Africa. It was much bigger, much stronger, much richer than Israel will ever be, you know, in terms of size, in terms of wealth, in terms of resources. And gradually it all folded and folded and folded and collapsed. And we, you know, Israelis are like the whites in South Africa. We're not organic. We are the result of settler colonialism. But now there are white South Africans. This is the reality. You know, it's the same thing in Palestine. There's this new thing called Israeli Jews who live in Palestine, and they're part of the landscape. But they cannot continue to live with the privilege that they deny everybody else, they deny the Palestinians. And they will only realize this, sadly, that's the way people are. They will only realize it once they're brought to their knees and they have no choice.
In wrapping up, Miko, what the Israeli propaganda machinery, state propaganda machinery has successfully done, perhaps in the African continent, is to convince Africans that Jewish people are a monolithic group. They have convinced African states to some extent, also through corruption in many other ways we know, that they are being victimized, they are being targeted, and so on. And this is amazing for activists like myself, hearing that narrative and seeing activists like yourself who were born in Israel, who were raised Zionists, come out and say, but no, this is incorrect. What would you say to African activists who've been fed that propaganda, to African leaders, African church leaders, religious leaders, African community leaders who've been fed the propaganda that Jewish people are a monolithic group and an attack on Israel is an attack on the entire Jewish population?
Yeah, you see this, by the way, in America too. You see the black churches, by and large, support Israel as well for very similar reasons. I mean, in their case, it's religious because they read the Bible literally, and they say, well, these are the people of Israel and these are the people of Israel, so obviously they have a right. And I think it's not an easy task when we talk about religion. But I think the work that Africa for Palestine is doing, and I follow your social media, and highlighting the different people, the different personalities, Black Africans and white Africans, who have been steadfast in supporting the Palestinian cause and who have also been steadfast in supporting the rights of Africans against colonialism, against racism, is extremely important. And I think this is the way to do it. I think it's about education. I think it's about activism. I think it's about growing the camp and making it larger and expanding. And I think it's also about Africans and everybody else, actually, not only Africans, but holding their leaders accountable to this issue. I don't think there's anybody in Africa who does not know about the horrors of colonialism, the horrors of what the Europeans have done and continue to do in Africa. And to see the link with Israel, Israel is participating in all of that. I mean, just a story in Congo, there's the assassination of Patrice Lumumba and the support for Mobutu. Just that is enough. Support for people like Idi Amin. I mean, Israel has been a part of supporting every brutal colonial power in Africa and beyond, in other continents as well. I think it's very important for people to see this. And I think, again, this initiative of Africa for Palestine, I remember when it started and I started seeing it on social media, I thought, this is wonderful. This is a fantastic initiative. And it is so important. And the thing is, Israelis like to see themselves as these open, liberal, even though they're deeply, deeply racist. And the way Africans are treated by Israel, that's a whole other story that I think needs to be discussed at another time, is an incredibly racist colonial enterprise. And the only reason they're interested in Africa is because they want the resources. They want to continue to pillage and rape and destroy and take as much as they can from Africa. So again, it's about expanding the camp. It's about educating. It's about telling people, country, leader after leader, whether it's local leaders on the local level or it's national, on a national level, hold their feet to the fire and say, look, you cannot support this regime, which has participated, if for no other reason, just what they've done in Africa. Even if they don't care about the Palestinians, look what they're doing in Africa. And this is how we defeat this. This is how we win. I mean, it takes time. It takes a lot of work. And again, my hat's off to Africa for Palestine for doing this. And I'm very happy to participate in this. But it's a crucial part of the equation. It's a crucial part of the struggle to get behind BDS and to not even participate in this nonsense dialogue of whether Israel is apartheid or not apartheid, whether Jews are this, that, or the other. First of all, Jewish people have never been monolithic. I mean, you had Jews in Yemen, and you had Jews in Africa, and you had Jews in Poland. They can't possibly be a monolith. And Jews have different opinions regarding Zionism as well. So it's just a question of educating. And of course, they have the advantage. They've been doing this longer. They've got more resources than we do. The Israeli government invests millions upon millions in these campaigns all around the world, in Asia, in the Arab world, as we know, and certainly in Africa. And we need to stand up and fight it as much as we can. And I'll say one more thing. When Israeli officials come to visit, there needs to be protest. When Israelis need to know they are not welcome, that they are not welcome. Israeli consul generals, Israeli business people who come representing the state of Israel should face difficulties. They should face protests. They should be told. They should be made very, very clear to them that they're not welcome.
Comrade Miko, thank you so much for joining this webinar series. Comrade Miko Peled is on Facebook, Miko Peled Official. He's on Twitter as well, Miko Peled. For the audience who want to pick his brain on what we've discussed in this particular webinar series, you find him there and he'll be able to respond to you. Thank you again so very much. We appreciate this. The video will remain in a video tab, and we are in the process of getting it on YouTube as well. We'll give an update the audience on that one. But the video will be now under video tabs on our Africa for Palestine Facebook page for those who want to watch again for future reference. Thank you again, Miko, and have a good afternoon. I think.
so much. Take care. It's a pleasure.
Bye. Bye.